Hello, and welcome back to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following story is part of the Mayhem Cerebrum project, linked to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request. I think of this little section of stories I've written, which I'm mostly done with. I have 3 stories left in this little section. I think this one might be my favorite. But it's like a Hedgehog favorite. It's not like one of the big bombastic ones. It's like I don't know why I like this one, I just do. So without further ado, here is Short Stacks and Sleuthing. At first, consciousness crept back upon him slowly, a sort of general awareness splattering across his brain space. Then, suddenly, it returned all at once as the pain hit him. His head throbbed in time with the usually gentle ticking of the clock tower. Now it instead felt like it was stabbing him with every single sound. It was at moments like this that Bake wondered why the fuck he decided to live in a clock tower in the first place. God, his head hurt. His head hurt, and his stomach was churning, and his tongue felt like sandpaper. He'd really overdone it last night. But that thought annoyed him. Bake had never even gotten close to overdoing it before he'd had to vanish. At first, he'd just assumed that he was out of practice. 50 years spent drifting in and out of coherency could do that to a person. But as the months went on, and he still found himself unable to bounce back quite so effortlessly from his typical escapades as he had before, he was slowly wrapping his head around the horrifying thought that this state might be permanent. And if that was the case, he was pretty sure he knew exactly who the culprit was. If he had been in full control of his faculties at that very moment, Bake would have easily shaken off a thought like that. Yet, as it stood, in pain and pseudo-delirium, it started circling. Like a Tweety bird in a stupid cartoon, and he was the dumb fucking cat who couldn't catch it. This did not help the feeling of something not being right under his skin. It wasn't a constant feeling. A lot of the time, he felt entirely normal, but every once in a while he'd catch himself saying something out of character, or he'd see something that would suddenly trigger this feeling of anti-deja vu. Like that. Just like that. Hadn't somebody else had that thought before him? Bake hated that feeling, like someone was watching him from inside his own head. He hated it, and he didn't know how to make it stop. The sudden bout of irritation nearly brought him to his feet. But before he got a chance to properly lose his shit, he noticed that he wasn't alone. He couldn't even sit up, as 2 arms were clamped firmly around one of his own. He didn't even have to look over to know it was Kay. This very position she had him in was a move that he dubbed the Kay Special. Obviously, he'd experienced it more than once. Even the first time it had seemed familiar. Stupidly familiar. All right, he had to stop going down this train of thought. Bake glanced over at her. Her face was different. That helped. It was more defined, more adult, much more his type than the last one. He didn't know whether her hair was natural or not, but it was definitely more convincing than the bottle bleach she'd had going before. It suited her a lot better. This body in general felt a lot more her. There was always an incongruity in the way demons moved in skin that wasn't their own. The more foreign the skin, the easier it was to spot. There was almost none of that with this body of hers. Plus, she was hot as fuck in it. So, at least she was no longer a reminder of that thought he shouldn't be thinking right now. She was his Kay, though she would definitely shoot him one of her infamous glares if she heard him say that. Ugh, God. Now he was thinking dumb thoughts again. He was too sober for this shit. Also, he was busting for a piss. Slowly, gingerly, he unraveled himself from her grasp. Maybe not as gingerly as he'd thought, because just as he pulled the comforter back, she stirred. "Where are you going?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Nowhere special." He slipped away and stood. Kay grunted in displeasure, but wasn't conscious enough to argue. "Don't go far." She rolled a little closer to his side of the bed. "Doug." His whole body grew very cold for a moment. Genuine anger was a rare emotion for him, but here he was, grinding his teeth together and seething. He wanted to slap that name out of her mouth. get the feeling passed just as quickly as it came. She was out cold. It sucked, but the mistake was unfortunately easy to make. And in reality, it might not have been much of a mistake at all. He sighed and ruffled her hair gently. "He never is," he muttered, and stumbled out of the room. "Can I ask you something?" Kay flopped down on a cracked leather couch, one of several on the second floor of the clock tower. Across from her, Jack was sprawled out, yawning. "Depends on what it is," he grunted. It had been a long night for all of them. Kay had been awake for a good hour, long enough to put herself together and at least attempt to shake her hangover. By the looks of it, Jack had been conscious for maybe 20 minutes tops, but it wasn't as if Kay had anything better to do than annoy him. She'd woken up alone this morning. Again. It was one thing if it was her own room, but to be abandoned in someone else's bed was just weird. It had happened a couple of times, too. Even more odd was that inevitably, about a half hour from now, he would stroll back in as if nothing had happened. When Bake just leaves in the middle of the night, do you know where he goes? Jack paused and sniffed once, thoughtfully.
Can't say I do. Guess I never really considered it.
In all the time you've known him, not even once?
I've learned not to think too hard about anything he does.
He shook his head.
Just gonna give yourself a bloody headache.
Hey, kids! How's tricks? Well, there was that thing they said about devils and the speaking thereof. Bake's head popped up from the stairway, and there he was, morning cigarette in one hand and Bloody Mary in the other. He and Jack immediately started going on about something or other, but Kay stayed quiet. Jack probably had the right idea. Thinking about Bake's motivations for doing anything would most likely be a dead fucking end. But still, it bugged her. It mostly just seemed out of character for him. Not that he left, mostly just that he was so quiet about it. Bake, in her experience at least, was never quiet about anything. It was just strange. It didn't make sense, and Kay didn't like it when things didn't make sense. She'd simply have to do something about it. It was a very simple process to get him drunk a few nights later and convince him to fuck her. To be fair, very little convincing was actually involved. It was more a matter of getting him to stay at the clock tower with her instead of going out on the town and bringing somebody else back. But, again, that wasn't very hard. Usually they ended up in bed together when they were both fucked up, and Kay for some reason thought it sounded like a good idea. She still tried to convince herself that she had learned from past mistakes. She was keeping him at arm's length this time, and she was definitely succeeding. Shut up. All this little scheme was research. She was determining his potential weaknesses. Absolutely. Yet even sober, she couldn't deny that the man was very good in bed. And then she lay there, sober and bored, as he passed out from a combination of rum and a mysterious liquid he dubbed Daddy's Party Juice, and hoped that this would be one of those nights when he decided to wander off. And so it was, right around 6 a.m, that he finally did. Kay gave him a minute head start, then followed after him. Discord was chock full of little out-of-the-way places that you would never find out about unless you happened to wander into one, and whenever you found such a place, you kept that fucking shit to yourself, because as soon as word spread, it'd become popular and then it would be ruined. Nearly everyone in Discord had a place like that, and Bake was no exception. Katie Lou's grease pit was located in an alley off another alley, and yet somehow still remained its own separate squat little building. On the inside, it looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1950s and was always blissfully empty. Well, almost empty. Jesus, kid, you look like shit. The portly woman behind the counter crossed her arms as Bake stumbled inside. He skidded across the cracked tile floor and plopped onto a stool across from her. A good fucking morning to you too, Katie Lou. After a second spent defying the perceived brightness of the fluorescent lights, he gave up and his face flopped down into his arms. And I'm not a kid, you know. His voice came out muffled by his coat sleeve. I'm older than you, remember? By a lot. Then how come all I see is a washed-out twink with a bad haircut? Because not all of us are sad little mortals who shrivel up like prunes by 60. You think I look 60? She blushed girlishly, patting her light pink updo with satisfaction. He glanced up blearily. Oh, that's right.
I forgot you're actually decrepit on the inside.
I'll have you know I'm not a day over 90, and I've still got another good 2 decades in me at least. Now, were you gonna order or did you just waltz in to bitch at me? Bake couldn't help the small, wry grin that spread over his face.
And what would you say if I told you it was the latter?
But she'd set him up for that one.
We've got a sign for that. Put it up just for you.
She pointed off to the far wall, where a small metal plate had been hung. In bold, capital letters were written the words, "Fuckwads don't get flapjacks."
Well, I guess you leave me no choice then.
He leaned back, hitching his shoes under the bar below the counter.
Get me some eggs over easy, bacon, sausage, hash browns. Don't forget the fucking hash browns. Biscuits and, fuck it, smother the whole thing in gravy.
You don't want, like, some fruit? Or maybe oatmeal?
Oatmeal ain't gonna cure my damn hangover. Grease, woman, grease!
He banged his fists on the counter.
That's the name of the joint, ain't it?
She shook her head, pursing her rouge-red lips together.
One of these days, you're gonna give yourself a fucking heart attack. Sometimes I wish I could, so I wouldn't have to listen to your nagging.
He continued to mumble to himself as Katie Lou turned back towards the kitchen. There was nobody in there, but she made a few vague hand gestures and the sound of sizzling bacon filled the room. Satisfied, she turned back to Bake, but frowned as she happened to glance over at the door behind him. He followed her gaze, only to sigh when he saw who was standing on the threshold. She opened the door tentatively, an eyebrow raised. Maybe she had been wondering if she had the right place, as she seemed to relax when she spotted the white hair and horns on the man at the counter. Still, she seemed a little caught off guard. "You looking for some breakfast, hon?" Katie Lou asked. Nope. Kay smiled, a bit mischievously. "I'm actually looking for him." Bake sighed again, even heavier this time.
So you followed me, huh?
I've got to say, I was not expecting to find you at a place like this.
And just what were you expecting?
My bets were on an opium den, or maybe laying on the top of Outlook Rock staring wistfully off into the void. Katie Lou snorted, and Kay turned back to her. "I'm sorry, I've been rude. I guess I should have assumed he wasn't going to introduce me. Hi, I'm Kay." She stuck out her hand, which Katie Lou only stared at skeptically. "Okay." Attempting in vain to disguise the gesture, Kay withdrew the offending appendage. "Well, my curiosity has been sated, if somewhat anticlimactically, so I'm going to finally go to bed. Don't expect me in today."
"Not gonna stay for pancakes?"
Bake asked, somewhat condescendingly.
"I'm sure if you asked nicely, Katie Lou would put sprinkles on them for you, princess."
"Thanks, but I think it would take me days to wash the grease off my clothes." After grimacing slightly at the general atmosphere of the place, Kay smirked one final time and vacated the establishment. Katie Lou rolled her eyes a little, and Bake seemed to agree with her.
"Good fucking riddance, huh?"
But she couldn't help noticing that he stared at her retreating back slightly longer than was strictly necessary. When he turned back, he found her with her face in her hands, blinking girlishly at him.
"So, is that her?"
she asked, when he just looked puzzled.
"Her who?"
Katie Lou huffed.
"You know, her."
She made an obviously obscene gesture in demonstration.
"Oh, you mean the chick I've had sex with more than once?"
A stupid little grin worked its way into his expression.
"Yeah, that's her."
Pinching the bridge of her nose, Katie Lou let slip a small, exasperated noise.
"Well, yes, but no." "What are you talking about?" "Well, you know, she's the girl."
"I am honestly so confused right now."
"Oh, never mind."
She narrowed her eyes as if he was purposefully fucking with her.
"I thought she looked like a handful, but now I just feel sorry for her."
Bake was about to yell at her to spit it out when, quite of their own accord, several plates of fresh steaming breakfast landed on the back counter. Katie Lou placed them in front of him and sighed.
"Now eat your fucking pancakes."
He frowned.
"I didn't order pancakes." "No, but you would have in about 10 minutes, so I just made them now. You know me too well."
He grinned. After slathering the pancakes in syrup, he took a bite of those, and then another of his hash thing, and nearly moaned a little, leaning back.
"Oh, Katie Lou, what would I do without you, you beautiful bitch?"
"Probably drink more."
"You are not wrong there."
She smiled, shaking her head a little.
"I missed you, kid." "Still not a kid, but I'm glad you're still around anyway, despite the blatant disrespect."
He finished up his meal and seemed a little steadier on his feet as he stood. After slapping a fair number of bones on the counter, he turned towards the door.
Wait, Bake!
She called to him as she counted.
This is way too much. You know I don't take handouts. It's not one.
He waved and swung out of the door before she could stop him.
I'm just really bad at math. That stupid son of a...
She muttered, but smiled a little. The kid may have been a wreck and a half, but he was good deep down. At least she thought so. Maybe it was just age talking, but he'd seemed a little different since he'd been back. Well, this morning had assuaged her fears, at least for the most part. Scrubbing the counter, she hummed to herself, waiting for it to reach the time when a few sane customers might stumble upon her little diner. As she did, she decided that she'd go buy herself some new nail polish with his tip. You know, as a little treat.